Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. We've been off for a little while, taking a well-needed break. We're now back with season 2, as it were, of our podcasts covering dystopian fiction, films, TV, books, all of that sort of thing. So some brief reintroductions for those of you who are listening for the first time. My name is Claire Coombe and I'm a writer and educator. And this is my co-host,
Masha and I'm a student and radio show host. So we're very glad to be back.
We are indeed, yes. And we are back with a big and exciting blockbuster. We're going to be talking about Wicked Part 1, the film, we should say, because although we have read Wicked the book and we know that the stage show obviously covers both halves, we can't do everything in one show. So this is going to be the film as it hit the cinemas, the end of last year?
Yes? Yeah, the end of last year. Yeah, about December time.
So Masha is going to tell us all about what happens in this film. So over to you.
Okay, so a quick synopsis. So the story follows mainly our character Elphaba, who in The Wizard of Oz, so this is Wicked is the prequel. In The Wizard of Oz, she becomes the Wicked Witch of the West. But here, that's before all of that. So we sort of follow her from her very conception and her birth and her childhood, where it was all kind of going a bit wrong from the beginning, as she's born out of an affair. And when she's born, she comes out with this bright green skin, which everyone around her sort of thinks is very frightening and disgusting. And sort of throughout her life, you sort of see how she's like rejected by people on all sides of her, including her father, who blames Elphaba for the death of her mother, which we'll get into in a little bit. Quite a sad story. And it all sorts of kicks off for her when she is dropping off her younger sister at her first day at university at the school called Shiz. Elphaba, sort of in a fit of anger and protection over her sister, ends up causing some magical ruckus, where the sort of professor of sorcery and magic notices her and decides to take Elphaba under her wing. And she is then enrolled at the school, meeting our sort of second lead, Glinda, played by Ariana Grande. And we also meet the Prince Fiero, who also becomes sort of a bit of a central character. And during Elphaba's time at school, she sort of is witness to the sort of subjugation of the animals, who in this universe are able to speak and talk and have jobs and do things. And one of her professors is sort of wrongfully taken away and put under custody. And Elphaba, you know, as someone who was raised by animal staff at her home, was, you know, she's very anti that, and so she ends up going to Emerald City under sort of not the pretense, but I guess for the reason of becoming the sort of Wizard of Oz's right hand in magic, as she's being trained up by this professor of sort of sorcery. And she goes there and she asks him, you know, this is happening to the animals. Can you fix this? Can you do this? And it is revealed to us that the Wizard of Oz is not in fact magical, and has sort of been under a guise of this all-powerful wizard, and really needs Elphaba to sort of enact his rule and power on the people, since he has no magical powers of his own. And that kind of is where part 1 finishes. And we see Elphaba reject that proposal and say, no, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to give up the rights of, you know, animals in order to live a cushy, comfortable life. and she sort of flies off with her broomstick, not sitting on the broomstick, just with her broomstick in her hand, which I thought was a very interesting detail in the film.
And her ever increasingly long
Yes.
cloak.
Gosh, so it just keeps on growing. Where does it go? Also, ever increasingly longer films. Everything sort of seems to become longer and longer these days. I can't believe.
That's true. Although I have to say, it didn't feel too bad. It didn't
didn't
feel necessarily
that
like
long. No. But I do think how did they manage to cover all of that plus the second half in the play in the same amount of time as part one? I don't know. Clearly,
is it just an epically long theatre experience? I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I've seen it I actually, in fact, have seen it twice, but this was very like many years ago now. So could not tell you. But yeah, I definitely think it was under 3 hours with an interval, in fact. So I don't know, but it did. I agree. It didn't feel as long as the
sometimes long
actually
films
was.
really can drag on, but I would say, yeah, don't be put off by the length of it. And obviously, one of the issues is always that if you sing everything in a show, it takes longer.
That's so true. That's
if we all went through life putting things into song, doing choreographed sections in between, it would take us much longer. Did propose to Masha that obviously we should sing large extracts during this podcast. Might leave those,
and we were going to add in our own little sort of variations on vocabulary. I don't know if you noticed this in the movie, but I can't come up with any examples off the top of my head. But gosh,
things like
Glinda, stonification.
That sort of thing.
So guilty of doing this. I was just like, what is going on? Is this some sort of like Aussian dialect?
Yeah, I think so. Pronuncification is the one that comes up with her name.
Yes. Yeah, pronuncification. What is that? I don't know what the purpose of that was.
No, but I suppose it makes more of this kind of like slightly weird and wonderful otherness to the world. Definitely. So I think it's worth going through. We often break things up really thematically, but I think that today we can sort of go through the film because a lot of this develops, chronologically as it's revealed to Elphaba. And you mentioned her birth, but when we actually see the opening of the film, it correlates with, as it were, the close of the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's a pretty uncomfortable opening. I suppose it's doing the same thing as Ding Dong the Witch is Dead in The Wizard of Oz, the film. But the opening number, No One Mourns the Wicked, and the whole portrayal of the propaganda in the background that has led to this hatred. So I don't know, did you feel that was a bit uncomfortable?
Yes, definitely. I guess like the juxtaposition of such joy, and it's sort of this like classic little townsfolk, jumping around, dancing. I mean, I've sort of, very much like drives home a bit of like an us versus them, or I guess like an us versus her dynamic between I guess like the people of Oz and Elphaba. Although I feel like it's very like Munchkin centric at the sort of the general consensus about Elphaba is like always I feel like when I say the people is very much from the perspective of the people of Munchkinland, which makes sense since she's the daughter of the governor of Munchkinland.
Indeed, yes. And I think that, again, there's probably something taking the sort of the Munchkins as the probably the most famous of the peoples of Oz from the 1939 musical. And therefore that fits with people's expectations, perhaps. And it also gives that idea that these are a persecuted people who have been freed, and we're left wondering, well, in what way were they persecuted? Why is the face of the witch this idea? Lots of kind of Big Brother type allusions to, she's watching you and things like that, which then pick up on themes later on about Oz and his approach, the wizard's approach to ruling Oz. Actually, things like spying, things like identifying sedition and so on, definitely coming through there. And And there's that overlaying of the Munchkins kind of chorus joy with Glinda's Ariana Grande doing her I have 4 octaves of range, and what do they call it? Is it called the whistle voice or whistle tone?
The whistle tone, whistle tone. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I was quite a high soprano when I sang, and I don't know anything, I don't have that octave at all. So she's doing all of that very high.
I think she does a brilliant job actually within that scene of sort of kind of communicating a bit of like the inner conflict she probably feels, like, because I do pick up on that, like, without the context of already kind of knowing a bit of the plot of the film, like you can kind of see she's kind of on the side of these celebrations, kind of like looking in on them, being like, yes, the witch is dead, but on the other hand, like, I think she's kind of singing about how the wicked, although no one mourns them, they are incredibly lonely, and they're almost kind of pitying, and she's feeling quite a lot of, I don't know, I guess empathy for the wicked in this case,
which is the thing that characterizes Glinda's development through the film, isn't it, really? She responds to the question from the Munchkin child, why does wickedness happen? This is another one where there was one of these word variations, because I think she says something like, many people find that confusifying. Are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? And that's what leads us into the flashback to his childhood. But you're right, I mean, there's this whole conflict for Glinda where she is known to have, the allegation is made that she was friends with Elphaba, and she tones that down. It's very much
evades the question a bit.
She was my friend. No, she was an acquaintance. I knew her a bit. So I mean, we get this background, and including, I should say, there's the burning of the effigy, which really goes all out for celebrating the death of,
and very much like on the witch metaphor, classic, totally. Like witchcraft kind of hunting down.
The other thing I thought was interesting, which comes as a bit of a theme, which I think if you watch it a second time you notice more. You know how Glinda arrives in her bubble?
Yes.
And it's all about, she's so magical and things like that. But then you realise that when she re-bubbles herself to leave, she presses something with her foot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like completely clear, but it fits more with the theme of like machinery and clockwork and so on than it does with the idea of magic, which I think again is supposed to sort of remind us that there's a lot of sleight of hand, pretense, that sort of magic, conjuring, sort kind of
showmanship, illusions. Appearance, and like presentation, kind of and it obviously makes sense because at the end, Glinda kind of decides to not side with Elphaba and her rejection of the Wizard of Oz and her sort of magic professor, who we should probably check what the name of that character is.
Madame Morrible.
And in the end, Glinda just kind of takes her place in this grand scheme.
Exactly.
But and then it kind of all relays with how the Wizard of Oz, his sort of presentation of being magical is actually all, again, clockwork, and he's this kind of big inventor. And he was actually inspired, by loads of different people, but in the book The Wizard of Oz, inspired by Thomas Edison as a sort of like beloved American inventor. Emerald City was sort of inspired by the White City amusement park outside of Chicago, which was just sort of this like amusement park with loads of different little gadgets and a hot air balloon, which is like a central imagery of the wizard.
Exactly. And the fact that we learn that the wizard came from the State Fair, the Omaha State Fair, that's his background. He was this kind of performing magician. And we get told that story explicitly in The Wizard of Oz. It's obviously alluded to in a number of places in Wicked as well. But yes, I thought that it was a nice touch there at the beginning. There's quite a lot of full circle stuff, actually, isn't there, in the film? But with Glinda, as you say, she, like Madame Morrible, is somebody of limited talent who then plays out on a stage, self-made stage to convey that she has a power that she doesn't have. It also comes up. We were talking about the song "Popular." It's one of the really interesting things that I don't think we noticed necessarily. I didn't notice the first time that I listened to the song. There's a bit in it where Glinda explicitly says, that leaders aren't actually clever. They're not actually, particularly astute or anything. They are simply popular. And that, I mean, we should say that, we managed to take this break from podcasting just as America went to pieces.
Yes.
We fully credit that there is a real life dystopia going on in the US at the moment, and much love to all our US listeners as they live under a coup. But there are really strong parallels, I thought, between the way in which we get this kind of performativity of power, the othering and so on, which we'll talk about more, coming through, and just that thing about not necessarily having to be great in any way to be a leader, but having to portray yourself as somebody who other people are fooled by, as it were. That popularity contest element that we see in US elections, and we see with the way that Glinda sees popularity and her own successes. So that comes through nicely. There's this idea about where does wickedness come from. What do you think about the whole narrative of Elphaba's conception and birth?
So she obviously sort of comes from this affair that her mother's having with this man. We don't know his identity yet. I think that becomes some sort of important plot point later, potentially. Sort of wink, wink.
I think if you listen to the voice, you know who is performing it, I think.
But yeah, no. So there's sort of this like a weird illicit green bottle, which like not much is sort of told about that, but apparently that's where Elphaba's greenness comes from.
Yeah, again, never explicit, but obviously implied, this elixir that her mother takes, which I suppose parallels drug use and alcoholism. I mean, and the fact that she's kind of lured into it by her own loneliness and her this I don't know, there's something uncomfortable in the narrative of kind of almost like not blame on the mother if she was drinking something that we're all very aware these days of fetal alcohol syndrome and things like that. You have responsibility among the mothers, but almost like this blame associated with her infidelity, that somehow that
this was deserved as a result
exactly of punishment for adultery.
And what's most interesting is what happens to, I feel, Elphaba's mother, and the way that so we discover that Elphaba's mother sort of has died and she's passed away, and like at first you're kind of thinking, oh, is this a result of Elphaba's birth directly? But rather it was a sort of playing out of the events of sort of Elphaba's greenness and how her father was so worried that the next child would be the same. Elphaba's sister Nessa would be the same color that he fed their mother lots of milk flowers. Don't think this is a real thing in our world, but in the Wicked world, milk flowers, which sort of caused both Nessa to be disabled, and she's in a wheelchair, and also Elphaba's mother to then pass away from complications in childbirth, I think. But yeah, Elphaba's blamed for this, even though she wasn't directly the cause of.
No, and she takes that blame upon herself, as we see. She confesses later on that this is how she feels about her sister's disability, which we'll talk about some more. There's something there, I mean, obviously the greenness functions as an allegory in lots of ways, as does the animals, as we'll talk more about. But there's something with milk flowers explicitly, and the idea of whiteness that implies that it gives a sort of sense of like racial superiority to just as an undertone there.
Absolutely.
And obviously this othering of both daughters and the narrative of whether there is a source of blame for that is another very uncomfortable narrative, especially if we think about the way in which we're getting a lot of stuff coming out of the States from Elon Musk particularly about people with disabilities, particularly autism, mental health issues, being less than people in the sentiment that's being expressed. And I think that idea that there is something less and also something to be blamed about the condition in which both children are born, I think is very uncomfortable there. And obviously we see the outright rejection, it's all done in song, so it seems that little bit more kind of light-hearted and but very uncomfortable over the greenness of this baby.
I do think like throughout Wicked in its various sort of forms, it does a really great job of like having this almost like very background political narrative. Like even there's loads of moments in the play especially where there's these like little gags and jokes which are like politically charged, but because of its use of tone and the way that it like communicates that idea, like ideas, I don't know, I think it's very clever that it still manages to have quite like huge relevance, like also across a great span of time, because obviously
absolutely,
it's been around since the 80s, the book before that,
90s, I think 95.
I
90s. Think is the, but you're absolutely right, that this is it has retained its significance, and it felt like it came out as a film at a very a time when it spoke again in a new way to current issues. So there's obviously this various underlying kind of things that lead to Elphaba having this particular kind of attitude to life, sense of blame being put upon her by her father for things that are not her fault, but she functions as a sort of scapegoat. But that also obviously has an impact on Nessarose. So while we're sort of talking about it, how do you feel about the portrayal of disability I think in terms of Nessarose's character?
I feel like it was both an interesting tool to sort of show how in the world of Wicked, like Elphaba's greenness is much more rejected than like seemingly Nessa's disability. Sort of like there's a juxtaposition of how much the like extent of Elphaba's rejection and the way that her, like when she walks into a room everyone stares at her. Whilst I feel like that's the common kind of conception is like someone with disability has that, often has that kind of experience, but it is also still acknowledged, I think, with what's that munchkin's name again, the ginger one? Bok. All my homies hate Bok. We were just hating on Bok the whole time. I think we found him just really annoying, and like he was about to there's a sort of side plot where there's this little munchkin that asks Nessarose out, but in reality he has a huge crush from Glinda, and the only reason he does this is because Glinda sort of turns her attention onto Nessa and goes, oh, but that poor girl over there, I bet she'd love to be asked to the dance or whatever. They had a big party, but like I think it's also still acknowledged that Nessa knows there's a perception that people kind of feel sorry for her because of her disability at the same time. But I mean, I wish we saw a bit more of like how the world kind of accommodates her or doesn't accommodate her outside of like it being through the lens of like Elphaba and
absolutely. I think that it's an interesting difference. There's a kind of horror at Elphaba, whereas there is this coddling and this overwhelming pity placed around Nessarose that gives her no
tragically beautiful. That's
tragically
what they call
beautiful.
her,
That's what they
tragically
keep calling
beautiful.
her. Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, this kind of the pity date.
Such a backhanded thing to say.
It's the bit where what's her name? Is it Miss Coddle? Yes, Miss Coddle, the teacher.
Nice.
Yeah, exactly. His sort of says, "Oh no, tragically beautiful," and Elphaba's like, and I'm the I'd say beautifully tragic one.
Beautifully tragic,
so,
yeah, very clever.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, Nessarose, I think that we see a version of ableism that is in fact really feels really current. So it's sort of saying not that anybody is saying that, Nessarose shouldn't be at university and shouldn't be doing all the things that, young people her age would normally do, but perhaps are prevented to because of lack of access. Actually, she seems to have that access, but all the time it's this lack of independence that she's given. Her father is obviously massively overprotective. He sends Elphaba to look after her when Nessarose doesn't want to be looked after by her older sister. No one else is. And one of the really uncomfortable things, I think, where Miss Coddle seizes the back of the wheelchair without asking Nessa's permission, bearing in mind that Nessa is perfectly able to steer and will herself, exactly. And that thing about people assuming that they have the right to step in and offer help that you don't need. It's reflected as well with Elphaba, though, because Glinda says the same thing to her. I'm going to study sorcery, and then if you like, I can, make you not green.
This.
Exactly, fix it like you need fixing.
Yeah.
Credit to the film, they did cast Marissa Bode, who is a disabled actor who uses a wheelchair in the role.
Yes.
So that's quite nice to see. I said I wasn't going to draw contrasts with the book, but there is a really interesting thing here where Nessarose's disability in the book is that she is born without arms.
Oh, really?
Which is
changed up limb-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of see from a casting perspective on stage,
you've
got a wider pool of people that you can cast if you've got a wheelchair user. But it did make me wonder. I wonder whether in the sort of people's attitude to disabilities, they would find it harder to sympathise with somebody who has a disability that is perceived as grotesque versus somebody who has an ordinary body with all their limbs but is seated in a chair. But it's just an interesting aside. There's very big differences in characterizations of Nessarose between the book and the film, so we shouldn't dwell on it too much. But there's something there. The consequence for Nessarose seems to be that she turns into this almost unbelievably nice person in the film. Maybe frustrated, but generally, she just seems really lovely, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Whereas Elphaba is angry, really angry. And I thought that was, again, this is something that is very specific to the film, that what Elphaba has is some inner magic power that comes out as a cause of her anger. Any thoughts about that, both as a sort of metaphor and just in the way that it's depicted in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Nessarose's disability as well, I think there's like a common thing for people who have a disability to be portrayed like personality-wise without any other faults. It's kind of, again, kind of going back to like that tragic depiction. And well, I think sort of an Elphaba's side, I think especially with sort of her being an allegory for like people of color, maybe it like also kind of falls into like a bit of that stereotype of like lack of control. I don't know. I think, and Nessarose again also falls into that kind of like docile kind of characterization. And I guess maybe and like I don't know if it's set up as like to enunciate that contrast potentially, but I don't know. What do you think kind of is really that?
It made me think about, I guess, all the anger that gets directed at injustice without actually managing to effect any change.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of this, I think, as an underlying theme. One of my favourites being when Glinda changes her name to Glinda. That's an act
Yes.
of protest. But this idea that, you can people get angry about things, rightly or wrongly,
Mm-hmm.
and that anger can firstly kind of build up in oneself, and then secondly it can kind of like feel futile in the way that it gets used. And
Mm-hmm.
Elphaba kind of goes on this journey where she gets angry without being able to control that. She
And
then
I mean, like also having a bit of a lack of direct, like
mm,
place to direct that.
yeah,
Um,
exactly, because at that time she recognizes the issues, but she doesn't recognize where to place responsibility for those. And I think that's
yes.
another, a really good point for a lot of us, that, looking at where you can direct anger to affect proper change rather than just feeling that something is really badly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then she goes through obviously having that anger manipulated and the attempt of control um, by Madame Morrible,
Mm-hmm.
through to embracing it for her own purposes and being able to control it for example, the spell on the broom and her ability to fly and so on at the end. That's that mirroring of the flying, where Nessarose's chair goes up in the air and all the furniture goes everywhere, to
Mm-hmm.
Elphaba being able to fly and control that and so on at the end of the film.
Yeah, like being able to have her power serve her rather than the other people around
Exactly.
her.
Yeah,
Um,
and make the first step
and
towards
yeah,
doing something with it.
yes, exactly. And I feel like, yeah, her being able to attain control of her power is in line with her seeing a vision for herself and her purpose, sort of within the greater plot line, and
Mm-hmm.
not a plot line, but in terms of like a movement to save the
Mm.
animals, which I think, is her ultimate objective. I think, yeah, and like I think in terms of sort of Glinda's like she outwardly portrays herself as a do-gooder, and that's however all of her like classmates
Yeah,
see her,
constantly say,
and
she's
that's how
so good. You're
she's
so
so
good.
good, she's so good. But like all of it kind of comes, obviously, is like a virtue signaling, and when it comes, push comes to shove right at the end, she decides to sort of be docile and keep with the current system and the status quo that serves her, um, in return for other people's subjugation. And then
Yeah.
this is sort of where Fiyero comes in, where he acts sort of in contrast, where he portrays himself as indulgent and carefree, and sort of savoring the frivolous over the meaningful, but is then kind of demonstrates himself to be more rebellious in his true actions and beliefs, like in the scene with the classroom, and
Yeah.
where Professor, is it Dr. Dillerman, I
Dr.
think?
Dillamond, yeah.
Dr. Dillerman, sort of the goat lecturer, is taken away under custody, and they bring in a small lion cub in a cage. He when Elphaba puts everyone to sleep with her magic, he doesn't hesitate to take action, and do what's right, stealing the lion cub, taking it to safety. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I think, yeah, even though Fiyero and Glinda sort of are like paired together in the same,
Mm-hmm.
they're like contrasting characters in that sense,
Yeah,
I think.
absolutely. Almost like Fiyero wants to be seen as like Glinda,
Mhm.
but is really more complex.
What do you
Glinda, I
think
don't think
his
wants to be seen as more complex, but sort of, becomes so.
Yeah, what do you think Fiero's kind of motivations for portraying himself in that way are? Like, obviously his position as a lady.
I guess that there's something about, I don't know, we learn that he's been kicked out of a whole load of schools. And that might be the sense that, if he just plays the kind of like Prince Playboy character or whatever, that's easier than actually taking his life serious and his study seriously and potentially failing in that. I think that's an
Mm.
interesting element. He does, I think, have, we were discussing this, best songs. He probably has the best full number in Dancing Through Life, with
Yes.
some excellent choreography. And I have to say, Jonathan Bailey may be very kind of typical kind of Hollywood good looks, but he is really perfect in that. Yeah, really like. I mean, generally, just as an aside, the casting is fantastic, I
Really
think.
good, really good.
And any doubts about Ariana Grande being cast as more kind of like
Which
a
is
name?
crazy that people thought that, because she started out as an actress anyway. Like that's where her
and
origins were.
she is really very, very good, I think. So yeah, leads are all excellent. But yes, the theme where Fiero's saying that you shouldn't focus on education, thinking is a waste of time, we should all just live the unexamined life, is heavy with all this irony when you start to realize that Shiz is actually a place of indoctrination. Madame Morrible is, it's subtle in the musical because I can't take loads of time over it, but Madame Morrible particularly is obviously trying to take and control Elphaba, has her as a solo student. Once that kind of reflected glory turns out she doesn't, she's much less powerful than her own student. She wants to place her as a pawn in the Emerald City, thus maintaining her own relationship with the wizard and so on. So, we know in due course this is what she's like, whereas Fiero plays out that he wants to live this. It was, says to Glinda, to Elphaba, it says, it's not an act. I am deeply shallow. Shallow is one of my favorite descriptions. But yes, as you say, is he inspired by Elphaba, or is he inspired by the situation? Glinda doesn't like him after that because he started thinking and she doesn't approve. But evidently, apart from any of the sort of three-way sexual tension that is going on between Glinda and Elphaba and Fiero, there's also obviously some connection made between Elphaba and Fiero at that point, and reflected by the fact that his reaction seems to be to leave Shiz at the end and head out to do something new. Also, the question, of course, whether the lion cub is the cowardly lion of the future.
Oh yes! Oh my gosh! I didn't even make that connection. It's so clever.
To be fair, it's there in the book as a question,
is it?
not answered. So I didn't come up with it totally on my own. But
okay.
Given how many
theory.
little links there are between kind of, with the reflection of Elphaba's hand and her laugh and things, they play on the patterns, Should we talk about animals then? Capital A, animals. Yes. The animals who can speak and so on. We cast this narrative at a time when we can already see that there's been a long-standing erosion of the rights of animals, because there's already none in the student body. So they're not being taught, they're only teaching. There's only, 2 left as teachers.
And by the end of the movie, that's no longer true.
And we learn in Peter Dinklage's Little Number, he playing an excellent goat. He has this little animal group, and they talk about this idea that people are not allowed to teach, and the owl who's not allowed to preach, and this removement. I'm making up words now. It's contagious. The removal of voice from it's a fairly obvious but wide-reaching
metaphor.
Allegory. But I think it's good. I mean, what do you think it is trying to say allegorically?
I mean, it's a representation of any sort of marginalized group you could really think of. I think you have to be careful with it being like all encompassing, because obviously each kind of each story for people of color and immigrants and trans people and LGBT people, it's different. But yeah, I think obviously it does, like, maybe it's a little bit on the nose with the whole like we're losing our voice thing, but I don't think, sometimes I don't think it's bad to keep it like too simple.
No, absolutely. I mean, bearing in mind that this is a film that isn't
is like targeted towards children as
yes,
well.
exactly. As much as it has definitely got two levels of it. As a little anecdote with regard to this, I've been reading The Wizard of Oz, the Baum book, with my niece who is 8, and this is off the back of the fact that she went to see Wicked, and when I was watching it, I was thinking, well, there's going to be loads here that went over her head or whatever. But the one thing that she has taken away from it and likes to write on the screen in big letters whenever the wizard is mentioned in the book, she writes Oz lies. And then we have to correct the spelling of lies. But Oz lies, the wizard lies. These are the things that she's taken away from this. So, sometimes perhaps being on the nose is useful. Getting that, not only the sort of pathos for the animals, but actually a sense of why it comes about. Obviously, it's made really explicit in the final act when the wizard is like, you have to create an enemy so that you can redirect unrest against the group of your choosing, and this whole anti-woke strategy that seems to be obviously
the whole like huge, us versus them dynamic.
It does feel like particularly this speaks to that at the moment, and the attempt to kind of eradicate language around transness and queerness from the very top in the US at the moment seems like a particularly sort of strong reference point for how we might view the film as things stand. So I was just thinking that if we take the sort of stages as they're outlined in terms of the persecution of animals, and we apply it as an allegory to how trans people perhaps are being treated, you could say that we've got this idea that, well, we want to promote a conservative agenda around the family and sex and sexuality. So we choose a group of people and we say, that drag queens reading to children in libraries are in fact making your children trans, and they're sexually molesting them.
Gay.
Exactly. And this is all, this is all some sort of form of indoctrination. So we remove them from the public sphere and say that, well, we can't have trans people in libraries or in the as teachers or in the military or whatever. So we take them out of those public roles, and then slowly we start to eradicate the language around them, creating that increased level of voicelessness. And obviously, the idea with the animals is that they fail to speak at all, and therefore they essentially don't exist.
They lose their ability to to speak out against sort of eventually being degraded to these like second-class citizens. And I think that also comes like to where Elphaba feels such like empathy for them, not both sympathy and empathy, since she's kind of experienced that herself. And I think
an ally, not just because she feels
not
that
just
sort
because
of
she also feels that way, but but I think also her Dulcibert as a character, especially sort of as we see Elphaba's earlier years, I think is like that's one like a central connection to maybe how she's able to like sort of so easily maybe befriend Dr. Dillerman in the ways that other students don't necessarily do.
Yes, so the more that people don't have real life experience with
others,
it's this some of my best friends are gay thing,
yes.
But if you actually are in circles where you start to move with more people who are different from you, then you start to create greater empathy, and it's harder to persecute people. And I think that we see this, to take another sort of strand that you could apply this allegory to, we see this with this strong anti-immigrant narrative that is building in terms of the right in the UK, or in the US as well. Also there, particularly, it made me think there's been some very uncomfortable performativity around deportation. So, and to their great shame, the Labour Party has been doing this as well. The idea of playing out the arrest of people who are living illegally in the UK, and using that narrative to support.
And it's almost like the sort of the raids are very much like theatrical to the point, and it sort of comes through as well with Luigi
Mangione.
Mangione, yeah, with his, there's a sort of procession of him and all these guards and him in handcuffs and sort of like playing up this narrative of like how dangerous he is, and it's kind of the same thing. You didn't need all of those people with like massive armed guns and stuff, and that was like I think part of his defense was how much this was played up, and that this was almost kind of like a defamation. And I think it's evident the same with how people who are might be here residing illegally, the way that they're treated and sort of almost manhandled as this like dangerous. And it just like further sort of reinforces this narrative.
And you get sort of, then it's easier to sell a narrative of immigrants and criminality, even though factually speaking criminality is lower among immigrant populations. These kinds of things become less effective because they're less easy to sell than the big show. And obviously the big show is what happens to it happens with the caging and so on,
appearance and presentation,
and it happens at the end with the way that Elphaba has become depicted, both in terms of the visual imagery on the posters that we saw at the beginning of the film, and the way that Madame Morrible talks about her in public.
Well, speaking of sort of Elphaba and the way that she's labelled as this like wicked witch, during my little bits of research, interesting fact, her name is derived from L. Frank Baum's initials, so it's L. I don't know, it was really clever. I've been telling people that fact all the time, and they're like, what? But one of the biggest sort of inspirations for a lot of like the politics within the Wizard of Oz, and a lot of the kind of characterization of the witches within the Wizard of Oz, and I guess it comes through much more in Wicked, even though it's not written by L. Frank Baum. I think like a lot of inspiration is taken out of that. But Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, she was a writer and activist for different movements, including the suffragettes, Native American rights, abolitionism, and she was a sort of she was a big sort of participant in the sort of free thought movement. But she's quite a big inspiration of the witches in the book, and had quite an influence on L. Frank Baum. But she participated in lots of protests, and even befriended and learned the spiritual medical practices of native tribes in the state of New York. I think part of this also caused her to sort of ostracize herself from more like orthodox suffragettes due to her like secular temperament. But she wrote a book called Women, Church and State, arguing that sort of religion and the state has always been a tool to persecute and repress women, and explores this kind of witchcraft history, stating how the witch was one of the most sort of profoundly scientific persons of the age, and a woman of superior intellect was often deemed to be dangerous and not to be trusted. And this all sort of comes back to when Elphaba learns of the wizard's true nature and corruption. She's then vilified and labelled as this wicked witch.
I think it's worth, and I will write something about this, a bit of a review, because we can't go into everything with the book because it's very long and very different from the musical, and that's absolutely fine. But it is interesting everything you're saying, because when you look at Maguire's book, Wicked, there is this there's a very strong narrative around religion in it, and there is also a sense of I guess sort of the geographical sections of Oz as racially different.
Oh wow,
which again we don't, we generally get kind of like completely intermingled racial groupings as Wicked is portrayed. They don't sort of go down that road, so it's not really the scope to do it. But that would fit really well, and I'd be interested to see how people have written about the relationship between Baum's mother-in-law and no, I'm going to say her name. What was her name? I forgot.
Matilda Jocelyn Gage.
Okay, so there's a clear kind of overlap between the work of Gage and the work of Maguire in the way in which they play with these themes. And again, there, which is picked up more subtly, but more simply, perhaps in Wicked, this idea that Elphaba is not a wicked witch; she is simply named as a wicked witch. That's his terminology that gets used to persecute women.
But then kind of sort of disinvalidate what she's trying to communicate to the greater masses.
Exactly. But then she takes it for herself. She adopts it in the way that many persecuted movements have done.
Redefines it for herself. And again, it kind of like, in terms of the topics of power and wickedness, I think she finds power in herself within kind of like self-acceptance and maybe coming to peace with the way that she is, other people outward view her outwardly, and so just kind of going with it, which I think is
down to the fact that she doesn't ask the wizard to change the color of her skin. That level of acceptance, or the sense that it is less important than the bigger picture and the needs of others, which fits very nicely with something around this kind of directing towards directing anger, directing, I suppose, a sense of helplessness or despair into something that is meaningful, does require to some extent the removal of self, because yes, obviously everybody who is of any minority has the right to stand up for their own particular situation. But I think that especially those of us with a great deal of privilege, it's actually about saying, oh no, I will step out of this equation. First of all, to give voice to people who are not getting a chance to speak. She says, the two of us speaking for an hour, but nonetheless. But also saying, well, this isn't about me and how this affects me. So I am not an animal. I'm speaking for the animals. Perhaps it would be disadvantageous to me. So I want to become a lecturer at Shiz. We get rid of the animals. 2 spaces come up. I'm more likely to achieve that for myself. I have to say that the right thing is that there are still animals able to take those posts, even if, and I think that this is a journey that many white men have had to, particularly cishet white men, have had to realize with respect to the appointment of women, that actually it requires you taking yourself out of it, as well as saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had women in these roles, and so on. So we've skipped a little bit around, but I think that we should probably talk about Glinda a little bit more, because she has an arc of her own. Again, very much taken from the genre of the high school movie kind of. But what did you make of her arc? Particularly, you mentioned this idea of how she chooses the easy way at the end, but there is quite a lot of vacillation.
There's a bit of a to and fro there. I mean, I think her arc mainly centers on her overcoming her sort of prejudices, maybe around Elphaba and who she deems almost maybe worthy of her friendship in her time. And towards the end they form a very strong kind of mutual connection. Although I do feel, I don't know, maybe this is from my memory and perception, I do feel like Elphaba's given more towards their relationship than Glinda has.
Well, she forgives a huge amount, doesn't she?
She forgives a huge amount, but even just like bringing her on, Glinda wanted to learn sorcery, and sort of Elphaba made that happen, and inviting Glinda along to Oz with her, wasn't something that she had to do. I think that was like a big step to be able to share in that spotlight.
Bearing in mind when Elphaba sings "I'm Not That Girl," we can see that there is this, inherent feeling of envy or of being less than Glinda, because Fiyero will never see Elphaba feels that Fiero will never see her in the same way because she isn't this beautiful blonde, fitting a certain type.
Exactly. What do you think?
I don't know. I think one of the things that we probably shouldn't overlook is the amount to which Glinda is controlled by fear.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there's it seems silly, but one of the brave things she does is to join in Elphaba's unusual dance.
Yes.
And it's all very kind of Wednesday Addams, but but hers is much more kind of like interpretative dance with no music or whatever. And Glinda clearly risks her own ostracization. Yes, she does it out of guilt and so on and so forth, but she does make that gesture of friendship. But that costliness, I suppose, to her, it's fine while she can drag Elphaba along in her kind of reflected popularity. But once Elphaba goes too far on that kind of level of acceptability, turns against the wizard, I think that Glinda is afraid, and I think that she also doesn't fully understand.
What sort of is at play
exactly? Plus, there is a sort of a genuine issue at the end, which is that Glinda is trapped by flying monkeys and guards or whatever.
She doesn't have a sort of magical powers to fly up the tower with.
And falling into Madame Morrible's arms is obviously, succumbing to choosing to be submissive to the wizard, but she doesn't necessarily have the same options.
I mean, I think she also falls into that a little bit. Like, I think she's manipulated in the same way. Obviously, I think Glinda has a bit of that kind of airheadedness, like not quite having a grasp on the greater picture of things. But I think like in terms of her kind of giving into Madame Morrible, there's like an element of manipulation because she's sort of mourning her not friendship, but
absolutely. I mean, Madame Morrible's rejected her throughout the whole thing, and then suddenly she's there, so you can understand. Yes,
it's a sort of filler of also. It also I sort of hesitate to say that she's had much of a change throughout her arc. She still feels self-serving to me from the beginning and the end. Like ultimately, she chooses the easier lifestyle, being sort of on the right hand of the Wizard of Oz, and that's kind of what she wanted from the beginning as well, is like to learn sorcery and help people, but in a sort of self-serving way where ultimately is to make herself feel better and maintain this like popularity and the power that she gets from that.
And there's something Elphaba has to acknowledge that she has changed. Glinda says, this is all part of the final number, but she's saying, you can still be with the wizard, what you've worked and waited for. You can have all you've ever wanted. And Elphaba says, but I don't want it. I can't want it anymore. And she has to acknowledge that this is a change in her. And I don't think Glinda is ready to reject the rules of the game, as it were, in the way that Elphaba is.
I guess, I mean, I consider it easier probably for Elphaba, where for her life, the status quo was pretty horrible anyway. Whilst for Glinda, she's sort of, littered in luxury and, privilege. And so why would she want to, or she'd be much less inclined to reject that.
There is, of course, the short bit in Defying Gravity where the two of them sing together and they say, all the things they could do in tandem or whatever. So there is that kind of moment where Glinda is obviously tempted, and then when it gets even harder. But there's a positive thing there if we take it in its isolation, where working together you can effect change. And it's the isolation of Elphaba that really causes her ultimate arc of failure, the one that leads to her being melted by the wizard. By Dorothy, under the instructions of the wizard.
I'm curious what when did the water, sort of the whole witch water thing, when does that,
Yeah.
what's
So
going on?
in the book, she has an allergy to water from being very young.
Okay.
It's not really clear, is it? There's the bit where Madame Morrible puts an umbrella over her, in just when she's sort of saying, "Oh, she's a witch who can control weather," or she's a sorceress rather who can control weather. But there's not very much about it, is there? No.
Biological
But
plot holes.
yeah, yeah,
Water's important for those people who didn't know. Important to life.
that's right. Absolutely. Yes, yes. Please hydrate. Thank you. One of the things I did just want to comment on is that because this is a film that is sort of directed at children, obviously the
A major fan base of
yeah,
sort
I
of
mean, The Wizard of Oz was
mid-20s,
written
mid-30s,
for
yeah,
children,
queer people.
so we can't get over that. But even so, Baum is perfectly happy for the wizard to say, "I want you to. You don't get anything for nothing in this world, and you have to kill the witch for me to grant your promises." By the time we get to Judy Garland, she's told, "You need to bring me the witch's broom," and the implication
Yeah,
is that the witch will be dead.
wish is dead. Yeah.
When we're looking at Wicked, we have a slight sanitization of the arrest of Dr. Dillamond, because he's taken away. We get the sort of prophetic foreshadowing of caging that Elphaba experiences. But in the book, Maguire's book, very much not for children, Dr. Dillamond is murdered. And it did strike me that there is something important about retaining, I don't know, a reminder, maybe not for children so much, but we are talking about risk to people's lives in the situations that we are saying are being treated allegorically here. There is a risk to life when treatment is disallowed from trans youth, or where immigrants are wrongly sent back to countries in which they face danger, and so on. And the riots and so on this year also raise the fact that they're put in danger from those around them through the narratives that are being created. Oh, that's cheery. Best song for you?
Ooh, you know what? I'm going to go for an old classic. Just go popular. I actually think we were discussing this before we started recording. I feel like they didn't really linger on the whole sort of, classic little melody of popular, gotta be popular, which, as a sort of an original seer of the play and the musical in stage format, that was an absolute classic.
Yeah.
Claire, I think, which one was it for you? Dancing Through Life?
I do really like Dancing Through Life, although I think that the one
rotating library.
Oh yeah, I want a rotating library. Yes, all the books will fall out. Nonetheless,
well, they're defying gravity, so they'll be all right.
Exactly, so be fine. Yeah, I think it's a great library scene, and I just think that whole it's a really great piece of musical theatre, that whole scene, and I appreciate that. But I think that, I mean, Defying Gravity is the only one that I really have had stuck in my head since.
Yes, it is the most memorable.
Yeah,
I think that's a little bit what I'm experiencing with a lot of musicals, even with sort of recent like Disney productions, like original. A lot of the songs are just unmemorable, and I don't know whether that's just contest to the fact that just the music isn't as good, or maybe I don't know. Just the content of the songs, whatever. I'm not sure. They don't feel as earwormy as I feel like I remember a lot of kind of other musicals used to be. I don't know.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, it's not like Wicked is the first musical that's tried to address some really serious themes but often the power of the musical is in kind of the song that stays with you, whether that is do you hear the people sing and revolution, or whether it's something light and funny, and this is a musical that has all of those things, and I do think that I think that they're superior to many modern musicals. I'm definitely won over on that.
But, definitely. By the end of the film, I was definitely won over, because I was I think I was skeptical about about it. I think, you know, there's like on a cinematography perspective, there were like a lot of shared complaints about how, you know, the costume department and the set design was beautiful, immaculate. And my friend actually works on the costumes for Wicked.
Wow,
I know.
that's so cool.
Shout out to Iris Towers, who's probably not going to listen, but maybe she will. Excellent job, really, really impressive. So look her up on IMDb. But the color grading, I think, is where it falls flat, and a lot of people felt like, you know, this is some magical, fantastical world, and it just looks like any other sort of Netflix movie. Why is it so grey? You know?
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, it's walking in the you know, whether it wants to or not, it's walking in the footsteps of the Wizard of Oz, famous for its Technicolor and
yes.
so on. And yes, you know, that very different time, but there was an element. The first time I watched it, I felt perhaps maybe I was a bit more inured to it the second time. There's something about that kind of just over shiny, kind of
over saturated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And just
almost kind of plastic.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes. Which is a shame, because you say things like the stuff like the use of the Art Deco themes and the kind of steampunky kind of elements as well that came through, you know, all of that really beautifully done. Also, shout out to the uniform, although what is this university where you have to wear uniform?
I don't know. I can't.
The uniform.
Schools at university, I'm not sure.
I don't know.
We're talking about how Elphaba's actress, whose name is coming to me right now.
Erivo.
Yes, I think she's actually the only person in the out of the main cast who looks like she's a teenager, despite I think she's almost 40.
She's same age as me, which is not almost 40. I think you'll find it is our late mid-30s. She's 38. I checked it out because, you know, it's typical, isn't it? Like, she's 38, Ariana Grande's what, 31, Jonathan Bailey's 36 maybe, something like that. So you know, classic, really, isn't it? But yeah, and so they don't all wear this uniform. That's another thing that's weird about it. But if you do wear the uniform, then you get an amazing kind of array of options of how you can wear it, including kind of gender neutral trousers, gender neutral skirts, gender neutral half skirt, half trouser. Yeah, so I was definitely, as somebody who has had the unfortunate past experience of being involved in you know, uniform regulations at schools. I'm big into this idea of, you know, standardized themes that can be adapted according to your gender presentation.
Yes.
Whether you want to wear like a crazy kind of sweater vest in weird stripes because you were a munchkin.
There you go. Shiz, be it with all its problems, is somewhat woke.
Yeah. Exactly. So
next part 2 will be like about trans people and maybe like cross species. I don't know.
Oh,
it's all gonna get into that.
It's true. It's true. Yes, and indoctrinates all the people who see it. I was interested, just as a sort of final thought, when 8-year-old niece went to see the film. I think my sister was saying there was talk among the mums, as there would be in such situations. About not liking the idea of yet another film where all the girls were going to come out wanting to be like Glinda and wear pink dresses and so on. Whereas I see no reason why we shouldn't be just like generating a whole host of kind of dark academia wearing 8-year-olds.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Elphaba is obviously the preferable character and has all these amazing. I mean, I was very tempted to wear sort of waistcoat and shirt combination, but that would have been too much effort for today. But you know, that's it's doing wonderful things.
No, I love her like long plait towards the end where she like really, you know, because she sort of starts off maybe like with this sort of like low kind of plait that's hanging down on her shoulders, and then towards the end, I don't know, maybe I'm not a costume analyst, but I wonder sort of what the symbolism of her towards the end, sort of having that all swept back into like a
interesting. Obviously, it goes. Yeah, and it goes via the trying to be popular and doing the flicking of the hair, which
Yes,
I have to say is
flicking of the
so
hair.
funny. Ariana Grande practically falling over with the
Yes.
hair flick. But yeah, so I think a lot of stuff for what is a sort of,
Yes.
Hollywood's glossy, lots of singing and
Big
dancing.
blockbuster.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll reach people who perhaps wouldn't usually watch musicals because they feel like, well, why would you? Because I think that there's a lot. I mean,
Get off your high horses.
Everyone should watch musicals.
Exactly.
Proper musicals, good musicals.
Good musicals.
Yeah. And you really won't get better performances than these. I mean, that really comes back to
it was good.
The cast is fantastic. So, yeah, and it's got a talking goat in it. What's not to like?
What more can you ask?
Exactly. So, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion.
Mhm.
We will be back in 2 weeks when we will be doing an episode on an older film, but not an old film this time. I think it's from 2011. It's a film called In Time. Talked about quite a lot among people interested in dystopian narratives. So I think that there'll be a lot for us to get into our teeth into there. We'll be publishing our upcoming schedule of films and TV shows and so on, so that you can keep ahead. As soon as we know what they are, you will know what they are. And we have newsletter that will be returning to coming out fortnightly. So you can check that out on Substack.
Yes.
And you can follow us on Instagram for the time being until we feel that we can't cope with Meta anymore. So watch this space on that one.
When we get sick of Zuckerberg.
Exactly. Yeah. So excellent stuff. Well, thank you very much, Masha.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you, lovely listeners.
Thank you, lovely listeners.
And we'll see you soon.